In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about database vulnerabilities. In a previous video, we briefly touched on web problems. And often, if you have a significant website, there's probably a database of some sort on the back end of that. So when it comes to databases, where are the vulnerabilities? There are several possibilities. First of all, you can have flaws in the SQL code itself. So the SQL code could have a problem with a SQL injection. A SQL injection normally occurs when you allow the user control of a query that is posed to the database. The user input could contain some code that might, say, short circuit a query. The standard example is where you say username equals, and then you have what the user put in, and the user puts in something, and then a closing quote, and they say something like, or 1 equals 1. So what ends up happening is when the query is performed, it returns and says, yep, they answered the right password. I should log them in. Or even worse, why don't I return all the users in the database from a query? So a lot of bad things can happen from SQL injections. You can also have some flaws in the underlying database. Maybe it has some bugs. Those are some bugs that you might be able to find with something such as a vulnerability scanner, or they could be misconfigurations. Do they have weak passwords or no passwords for certain accounts? Do they have privileges for the user that's logged in whenever a website is accessing the database set too high? Does that user have the ability to delete things, the ability to change the database schema, etc.? They shouldn't have those sorts of things. And of course, you can have flaws in your web server and its integration into the database. Now, finding those flaws, there's some different tools. We talked about this tool in a previous video called SQL Map. And SQL Map is a nice tool that lets you look at a website that is using a database and tell you, hey, here's some potential problems. If you want to find flaws in that underlying database, vulnerability scanners are your friend. We've already talked about NICTO. If you look at potential problems, you can have the possibility of executing external commands from your database. And it depends on the kind of database that you have. But if you're running Microsoft SQL Server, you can actually install a command shell inside of it. Oracle, you can load the Microsoft Visual C runtime library into a stored procedure, and that will allow you to do most anything you want. MySQL and DB2, both of those databases are also vulnerable to stored procedures. So if you have a stored procedure that has some vulnerable code, or it's trying to go out to the operating system in order to run something, you might have a problem with someone being able to exploit a vulnerability on your website. And of course, if you have web vulnerability issues, you might want to use something like NICTO again. Last time, we introduced Vega, and we said Vega will tell you if it finds some potential problems. It's actually been running a little bit more since the last video was recorded, and you'll notice that it's still finding issues. But if I look under high priority issues, there is some shell injection, but there's also some SQL injection problems listed here, and it will tell me what the URL is. So I can take this URL and input that into another tool, such as SQL Map, and it will try to get me some more information. It'll try to see if it can successfully inject some SQL. Also, we talked about NICTO. Here is the NICTO report that finished from last time. Notice this finished after 227 seconds. So that's not so bad when we compare it to some other things. So here is my report from NICTO. It says I was just targeting this one machine, this one port. Here's what web server I think it's running. And here are some potential problems. There's directory indexing. And again, all of these have open source vulnerability database reference numbers that you can use to look up more information about these flaws. So that can come in handy.